The first thing Elias Thorne heard was the crunch of snow giving way under a weight it wasn't meant to hold. Then a muffled cry, cut short. By the time he reached the gate, the woman was face down in the drift, her body burning with a fever so fierce he felt it through her wool coat. In that moment, Elias faced a choice that would cost him everything he owned. His cattle would have to wait. For the next 7 days, he would fight to keep a stranger alive in the crushing silence of his remote mountain ranch, not knowing that her fever held a secret that would unravel both their pasts. For Elias Thorne, the winter of 1889 had been a solitary battle against the elements. His entire world was the high valley, 200 head of cattle, and the relentless silence. He hadn't spoken to another soul in 4 months. The woman at his gate was an impossibility. He knew nothing about her, not her name, where she came from, or what desperate journey brought her to his remote fence line. He only knew the fever would kill her without help, and helping her meant abandoning the herd that was his entire livelihood. This is the story of those 7 days, and the hidden truth that arrived with the storm. He carried her inside, a dead weight in his arms, and laid her on the narrow bed by the stove. Her skin was dry and blazing hot. Elias Thorne was a rancher, not a doctor. His medical knowledge extended to setting a bone, stitching a gash, and dousing a horse. This was different. The fever had a grip on her, a vibrating intensity that scared him. He peeled off her soaked coat and the travel-worn dress beneath, modesty erased by necessity, and wrapped her in his own wool blankets. He stoked the fire until the iron stove glowed cherry red. Then he went to the rain barrel he kept in the lean-to, broke the inch-thick ice with an axe, and filled a basin with freezing water. For the first hour, he did nothing but apply cold cloths to her forehead, her wrists, the pale column of her throat. She didn't stir. Her breathing was a shallow, rapid pant. Outside, the light began to fail. His mind ran the calculations of neglect. 200 head of Herefords were scattered across the high pasture, relying on the hay he dropped each morning at dawn. If he missed one feeding, they'd drift toward the weaker fence lines. If he missed 2, they'd start breaking through. If he missed a week, he shut the thought down. The woman made a sound, a low moan of pure distress that had nothing to do with consciousness. It was the sound of a body fighting a war alone. Elias knew isolation. He'd chosen this valley 5 years earlier after things back in Wyoming had gone bad in a way he didn't talk about. The silence was the point. The work was the prayer. He communicated with his dog, with his horse, with the cattle. Human conversation had become a foreign language. Now, this stranger's labored breath was the loudest thing in the world. As full dark settled, he forced himself to leave her side. He pulled on his heavy coat, took a lantern, and went out to the barn. He forked hay into the sled, hooked the draft horse, and made a single, slow circuit to the nearest pasture. It was a token gesture. The cattle crowded around, confused by the night feeding. He knew it wasn't enough. He was choosing her life over their well-being, and the weight of that choice settled on him like a physical yoke. Back inside, her condition was unchanged. The fever hadn't broken. In the lantern light, he got his first real look at her. She was young, maybe 25, dark hair fanned across the pillow. Her hands, lying palms up on the quilt, were fine-boned but calloused, working hands. Her clothes, now drying by the stove, were plain but well-made, not the rough homespun of a homesteader. A widow, he guessed from the dark band on her left finger. But what was a young widow doing alone in the Colorado Rockies in February? The nearest town was Silverton, a hard 2-day ride south through passes that were likely closed. She hadn't walked here. Where was her horse? Her supplies? On the second day, the fever escalated. It began to shake her. Her teeth chattered so violently he feared she'd crack them. The chills would last for 20 minutes, then subside into a still, terrifying furnace heat. He had a small cache of medicines: willow bark for pain, powdered cinchona for fever, a precious bottle of whiskey. He made a bitter tea, lifted her head, and tried to get her to swallow. Most of it ran down her chin. He tried with a spoon. He tried dipping a cloth in it and letting her suck the moisture. He felt a desperate, rising incompetence. He was failing. By the afternoon, he had to face the real task. She had soaked through the blankets with sweat. She needed to be washed, and she needed water inside her or the fever would cook her dry. His face set in a grim mask of resolve, he peeled back the sodden wool. Using warm water from the stove reservoir and a clean rag, he washed her limbs, her back, the sharp angles of her collarbones. He did it with a clinical detachment, a rancher tending a sick animal. But she was not an animal. She was a woman, and the intimacy of the act, performed in the silent cabin, felt monumental. He dressed her in one of his own clean flannel shirts, the sleeves swallowing her hands. Then he tried the water again. This time, he managed a few spoonfuls. That night, he didn't go out to the herd at all. The wind howled down from the peaks, bringing a fresh skiff of snow. He sat in the chair by the bed, listening to the two rhythms, the vicious wind and her ragged breath. He must have dozed off. He woke with a start to a new sound. She was speaking. Her eyes were still closed, lashes dark against her fever-flushed cheeks, but her lips were moving. He leaned close, his ear almost touching her mouth. "Don't let them find it," she whispered, the words slurred but urgent. "The case. In the saddlebag, bury it." Elias froze. He pulled back and looked at her face. Her brow was furrowed in desperate concentration, living some reality inside the fever dream. "Who?" he asked softly. "Who shouldn't find it?" "The men from the company," she breathed. "They killed him for the maps. They'll kill for the assay." Then the thread of coherence snapped. She cried out, a wordless sound of fear, and fell back into the thrashing silence. Elias sat back in the chair, his heart pounding. Assay, maps, killed him. The words hung in the close, hot air of the cabin. This wasn't just a sick traveler. This was a woman running from something. He thought of her fine clothes, her working hands. He stood up and walked to the corner where he'd piled her belongings. He'd been too focused on her survival to examine them. Her coat, a small leather satchel. He opened it. A hairbrush, a few coins, a folded letter, the paper soft from handling. He didn't read it. Beneath it all, wrapped in an oilcloth, was a small, thick book, a journal. He carried it to the table. His hands were not quite steady. The lantern light pooled on the worn leather cover. He opened it. The first pages were mundane notes, supplies, distances, weather. The handwriting was neat, feminine. Then halfway through, the entries changed. They became hurried, anxious. "Michael is certain. The vein is not played out. The company's reports are false. They are buying out claims for pennies, knowing the silver is still there." A few pages later, he showed me the core samples. "The assay results are explosive. They prove fraud on a massive scale. We must get to the Surveyor General." Then the final entry, dated just 4 days ago. The writing was a frantic scrawl. "They know. A man followed us from the hotel. Michael is taking the long route through Thorn Valley to throw them off. I am to meet him at the Creek Fork. If you read this and I am not with him, they have done something. Get the samples to Judge Carrington in Denver. The case is in my..." The entry ended mid-sentence. Elias closed the book. The silence in the cabin was now a different kind of silence. It was charged, heavy with implication. He looked from the journal to the woman on the bed. Her husband, Michael, was a geologist. He discovered a fraud, and now he was missing, likely dead. The men from the company had killed him, and they were looking for her and for whatever evidence was in her saddlebag. He stood and went to the door. He opened it a crack. The night was vast, black, and empty. But was it? Were they out there already, tracking a missing widow and a fortune in silver secrets? He had a sick woman who couldn't be moved, a herd he'd already abandoned, and now, hidden somewhere in the snow, a saddlebag that men had killed for. The 7-day clock of her fever had just become a countdown to something far more dangerous. He shut the door and bolted it, a sound that felt pitifully inadequate. The saddlebag, her feverish words echoed. Bury it, but where was it? She had no horse. If she'd been on foot, she couldn't have carried it far from where she fell. It had to be near the gate. The thought of opening the door again, of stepping out into that exposed darkness where someone might be watching, made the muscles tighten across his shoulders. But leaving that evidence out there was worse. He pulled on his coat, took his rifle from its hooks, and slipped back into the night. The moon was a sliver behind scudding clouds, offering little light. He moved low and fast from the cabin to the rough pole fence, his boots crunching in the crusted snow. At the gate, he dropped to one knee, scanning the trampled area where she'd fallen. Nothing. He widened the circle, moving outward in a grid, his eyes straining against the gloom. 10 minutes passed. 20. The cold needled through his clothes. Just as he was about to give up, thinking an animal might have dragged it off, his foot struck something half buried under a sagebrush at the tree line. He dug with his hands. Leather. He pulled it free. A saddlebag, heavy on one side. He didn't open it there. He slung it over his shoulder and ran back to the cabin, feeling exposed with every step. Inside, with the door bolted once more, he dumped the bag's contents onto his rough table. There were clothes, a few more coins, a small tin of biscuits, and a long oilcloth-wrapped package tied with cord. He untied it. Inside were 6 cylindrical cores of rock, each labeled with tiny, precise writing. Drill samples. Next to them was a folded sheaf of papers, the assay reports. The numbers in the columns were staggering. Percentages of silver that would make any mine owner in the territory drool, and a handwritten map showing a specific vein in the played-out Solomon mine with a red circle around it. The fraud was not just speculation. It was documented, quantified, and sitting on his kitchen table. Elias rewrapped the package, his mind racing. The San Juan Consolidated Mining Company. He knew the name. It was the big Eastern-owned operation that had bought up half the played-out claims around Silverton in the last 2 years, promising new extraction methods. They employed dozens of men. They had influence with the territorial surveyor's office, and according to this journal, they were systematically lying about the silver content to depress claim prices, then secretly mining the rich veins for themselves. Michael, the widow's husband, had been their geologist. He discovered the truth, and it had gotten him killed. Now his wife, whose name Elias still didn't know, was the lone witness carrying the proof. He hid the package inside the cold ash compartment of his stove, a hollow space he used for storing valuables. Then he returned to her side. The fever was talking again, but now the words were fragments he could piece together. Michael, at the creek. The shot came from the ridge, she whimpered. Left the horses, ran through the ice water, so cold. Her journey through the mountains to his remote valley took shape in her delirium. A desperate, freezing flight on foot after her husband was ambushed, trying to throw pursuers off by leaving the horses, stumbling through streams to break her trail. The sheer will it must have taken to get this far, only to be felled by pneumonia at his gate, was staggering. The third day dawned gray and bitter. Elias was running on scraps of sleep. He forced himself to do a bare minimum check on the herd. What he saw turned his stomach. The cattle, hungry and restless from inconsistent feeding, had pushed against the southeast fence line. The old posts, weathered and weak, had given way. A gap 20 feet wide opened to the steep timbered slope beyond. At least 40 head were gone, scattered into the dense pine forest where rounding them up would be a week-long nightmare in good weather. In this snow, it was impossible. Their tracks would be covered by new falls. It was a catastrophic loss. He stood at the broken fence, the financial ruin of it hitting him like a physical blow. His entire life's work gone because he'd chosen to nurse a stranger. The guilt was a sharp stone in his throat, but when he returned to the cabin and saw her shivering form, the stone didn't dissolve. It just sat there, heavy alongside the duty he now felt. He stoked the fire, prepared another bitter willow bark tea, and resumed his vigil. That afternoon, a small change. Her fever broke. Not dramatically, but the terrifying, dry heat began to recede from her skin, replaced by a clammy, soaking sweat. It was the crisis point, he knew. She could drown in the fluid flooding her lungs now, or her body could fight it off. He propped her up with every blanket and pillow he had, leaning her forward to help her breathe. For hours, he listened to the wet, rasping struggle in her chest, helpless to do anything but wait. As evening fell on the 4th day, exhaustion pulled him under. He slid from the chair to the floor beside the bed, his head resting against the mattress, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. He was awakened by a touch, a light, uncertain pressure on his hair. His eyes flew open. The cabin was dark but for the stove's glow. He looked up. Her eyes were open. They were a clear, startling gray, clouded with confusion and weakness, but they were focused on him. Her hand, which had been touching his hair, withdrew slowly back to the quilt. "Where?" she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. "You're safe," Elias said, the words coming out hoarse from disuse. "You've been sick, fever, you're at my ranch." Her eyes darted around the shadowy cabin, taking in the log walls, the rifle on the pegs, the man kneeling beside her. Fear flickered in them, sharp and immediate. "Michael." Elias hesitated. He couldn't lie, but he couldn't deliver the full blow in her first conscious moment. "I'm Elias Thorne," he said gently, avoiding the question. "You collapsed at my gate. You've been here 4 days." 4 days, she repeated, the words hollow. The fear in her eyes didn't recede, it crystallized into something harder. "They'll be close." She tried to push herself up, a weak, futile movement. "The bag, the saddlebag, did you?" "I found it," Elias said quickly, putting a hand on her shoulder to still her. "It's hidden. The samples, the papers, they're safe." Some of the frantic tension left her body. She sank back into the pillows, her breath hitching. "You read the journal." "I did. Your name is—" "Eleanor," she said softly. "Eleanor Shaw." She closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, they were wet. "My husband." "I'm sorry," Elias said. It was all he could offer. She didn't cry. The grief seemed too vast, locked behind a wall of sheer survival instinct. The men from the company, led by a foreman named Cade, big man, scar through his eyebrow, they were supposed to escort Michael to verify his findings. It was a setup. They shot him at the creek fork. Her voice was a monotone, rehearsed as if she'd been waiting to say it to someone. "I was farther back with the pack horse. I heard the shot. I took the bag with the real samples and ran. They chased me for a day. I lost them in a rock slide, I think. Then the snow came. I just kept walking." Elias absorbed this. A foreman named Cade, professional killers employed by a powerful company. They had a 4-day head start to search, and they knew the general area where she'd vanished. His remote valley was no longer a sanctuary. It was a box canyon. "They'll be looking for any sign of habitation," he said, thinking aloud. "Smoke. Tracks." Eleanor's gaze was piercing despite her weakness. "You have a herd. You've been stuck here with me. Your tracks are everywhere." He nodded grimly. The broken fence, his daily trips to the barn, the path to the rain barrel, it was a map leading right to his door. "We need to move you. A better hiding place. There's an old line shack deeper in the valley near a spring. It's half collapsed, but it's not visible from any ridge." "You can't move me," she said, a cough rattling in her chest. "I can't walk 10 feet. I'll carry you on the sled tonight." The plan formed as he spoke, desperate and risky. "We'll bank the fire to look normal, leave the dog in the cabin. If they come poking around, it'll seem like I'm just out checking the herd. And if they wait for you to return—" "Then they wait," Elias said, his jaw set. "But they won't find what they're looking for." He stood, his body aching. "We need to go now, while you have a little strength from the fever breaking." He helped her drink some broth, then bundled her in every blanket he had. He fashioned a makeshift pallet on the wood sled he used for hauling hay. Moving her was agony. Every jostle sent pain across her face, and a coughing fit seized her that left her gasping and flecked with blood. The sight of it terrified him, but staying was a death sentence for them both. He wrapped the oilcloth package from the stove and tucked it into the blankets with her. "Hold on to this," he said. "If something happens to me, you know what it is and where to take it." He hooked the sled to his draft horse, Samson, and led him out into the silent, freezing night. He avoided the main trail, cutting instead through a narrow draw behind the barn, where the pine canopy would hide their movement from any distant eyes. The journey to the line shack was less than 2 miles, but it took over an hour. The sled bumped over frozen ruts. Eleanor bit her lip to keep from crying out. Elias' ears strained for any sound beyond the crunch of snow and Samson's heavy breathing. A hoofbeat, a shouted command. The line shack was a sorry sight, one wall sagging inward, the roof holed in 2 places. But it was shelter. He got Eleanor inside onto a bed of pine boughs he hastily cut, wrapped her tight, and built a small, smokeless fire of dry aspen in the old stone hearth. The warmth was meager, but it was something. "I'll be back before first light," he whispered. "I need to make the cabin look lived in. Don't stir the fire much. Smoke is a signal." Her gray eyes held his in the dim light. "You've risked everything. Your herd." "The herd's already gone," he said, the words bitter. "This is about keeping you alive now." He left her with a canteen, the last of the biscuits, and his pistol, showing her how to hold it. Then he made the lonely trip back, covering their tracks as best he could with a pine bough. He spent what was left of the night in a state of hyper-alert tension, sitting in the dark cabin, his rifle across his knees. He listened to the wind, to the settling of the logs, to the distant cry of a coyote. Every sound was a potential threat. Just before dawn, as a thin, cold light began to seep into the sky, he heard what he'd been dreading. The clear, distinct sound of a shod horse stepping on frozen ground not 50 yards from his porch. Then another, and another. They were here. Elias didn't move from his chair by the cold stove. He kept his breathing even, his hands resting on the rifle in his lap. Through the single frost-rimed window, he saw shadows detach from the tree line, 3 men on horseback. They moved with a slow, deliberate confidence that was more threatening than haste. The lead rider fit a leaner's description, a big man, broad in the saddle with a heavy coat and a hat pulled low. As they drew closer, Elias saw the pale line of a scar cutting through the man's eyebrow. Cade. They stopped 20 feet from the porch. Cade's eyes scanned the cabin, the barn, the empty corral. He called out, his voice a gravelly baritone that carried in the cold air. "Hello, the house." Elias waited a beat. Then he stood, slung the rifle casually over his shoulder in a way that kept his hand near the trigger, and opened the door just wide enough to lean against the frame. He schooled his face into the weary, irritated expression of a man interrupted at first light. "You're on private land," he said, his voice flat. Cade offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Apologies, friend. We're with the San Juan Consolidated. We're searching for a missing employee, a geologist named Michael Shaw. He and his wife were conducting a survey, got caught in that last storm. We're worried for their safety." The lie was smooth, practiced. Elias shook his head slowly. "Haven't seen anyone, not for weeks. It's a big valley." One of the other men, younger with a nervous gaze, was staring at the ground near the gate. At the trampled snow, the distinct signs of a struggle and a body being lifted. Cade's eyes followed his man's look, then flicked back to Elias. "Looks like you've had some activity here recently." "Wolf got into the chickens night before last," Elias said without missing a beat, gesturing vaguely toward the coop. "Made a mess." Cade's smile tightened. "Mind if we take a look around, in case they took shelter in your barn without you knowing?" Every instinct screamed to refuse, but refusal would be a confession. A man with nothing to hide would grouse but allow it. "Make it quick," Elias grunted, stepping fully outside and pulling the door closed behind him. "I've got stock to tend to and I'm already behind." He stood on the porch, a statue of forced nonchalance, as Cade and his 2 men dismounted. The younger one headed for the barn. The third, a silent man with a coiled spring tension, began walking a slow circle around the cabin, eyes on the ground. Cade himself walked up to the porch, his boots heavy on the steps. He stopped in front of Elias, too close. Elias could smell tobacco and cold leather. "Lonely out here," Cade observed, his eyes probing Elias' face. "It suits me. Hard way to make a living. Cattle all look scattered." Cade had noted the broken fence line, the lack of animals in the near pasture. He was piecing together a story, and it wasn't the right one. He saw neglect, struggle, maybe desperation. A desperate man might be bribable. A man could use a friend. A company like ours, we show appreciation for helpful citizens. Elias met his gaze evenly. "I don't need friends." From inside the barn, the younger man called out, "Foreman, in here." Cade held Elias' eyes for a second longer, a clear warning, then turned and strode to the barn. Elias followed, his pulse hammering in his ears. What had he left in there? The sled. Hay scattered from the hurried feeding. Inside the dim barn, the younger man was pointing at the ground near the stall where Elias kept Samson. Not at the sled, but at the floor. Boot prints, the man said. Small, woman's, I'd reckon. Elia's blood ran cold. He'd brought Alina in here on the first night, disoriented, trying to get her to the house. In his panic, he hadn't noticed her footprints in the soft dirt of the barn floor. They were faint, but they were there. Cade crouched down, examining the prints. He traced their path from the barn door to where they vanished on the hard-packed path to the cabin. He stood up slowly and turned to Elias. All pretense of friendliness was gone. You said you hadn't seen anyone. I haven't, Elias insisted, his mind racing. Those are old, from the fall. A peddler's wife came through, needed to use the privy. In February, Cade's voice was a low growl. You expect me to believe a peddler's wife was here in deep winter? He took a step forward. Where is she, rancher? The silent third man appeared in the barn doorway, blocking the exit. Found more tracks out back, he said, his voice monotone. A sled, heavy load, went off toward the north draw. Recent. They had found the trail to the line shack. The pine bough he'd used to sweep their path had been insufficient in the pre-dawn gloom. The game was up. Elias calculated his odds, 3 against 1. They were all armed. He was a good shot, but not that good. His only play was misdirection and buying time for Alina. All right, Elias said, letting his shoulders slump in a show of defeated honesty. You got me. A woman did come through. 4 days ago, like you said, she was sick, feverish. I put her up in the cabin for a night, tried to help, but she was raving, talking about silver, about men chasing her. I figured she was touched in the head or a runaway from some asylum. She stole a blanket and some food and lit out before first light the next morning. I didn't stop her. Didn't want the trouble. Cade studied him, weighing the new story. The part about her being sick and raving had the ring of truth. It was asterisk true. The part about her leaving, that was the gamble. Which way did she go? Elias pointed south, the opposite direction of the line shack. Saw her heading toward the high pass. Said something about getting to Silverton. I told her it was suicide. Didn't listen. Cade stared south, then back at the north draw where his man had found the sled tracks. He was being presented with 2 possibilities: a desperate, sick woman fleeing on foot south, or a hidden accomplice helping her via sled north. He turned to the silent man. Jens, you take the south ridge, see if you can pick up a trail on foot. Me and Cole will check this sled path. It might be nothing, might be this fella hauling wood. He turned his icy gaze back to Elias. You're coming with us, to show us the way. It was the worst possible outcome. Not only were they investigating the real trail, but they were taking him along, separating him from his rifle, which he'd have to leave behind if he was guiding them. He was being led to the very place he needed to protect. There was no choice. He nodded, playing the cooperative, annoyed local. Fine, but it's a waste of your time. It's just an old line shack, half fallen in. They set out, Elias walking ahead with Cade leading his horse beside him. Cole, the younger one, brought up the rear. The journey was a silent, tense procession. Every step took them closer to Alina. Elias' mind worked furiously. He could try to break and run, lead them off, but they were on horseback. He could try to fight, but he was unarmed. His only hope was that Alina had heard them coming and had hidden herself and the evidence. As they neared the draw that concealed the shack, Cade called a halt. From here we go quiet, he whispered. Cole, you circle left, I'll go right. You, he said to Elias, stay put, make a sound and you're dead. They left him there, tied to a tree with a rough piece of cord that he knew he could work loose given a few minutes. But he didn't have a few minutes. He watched, helpless, as the 2 professional gunmen melted into the pines, advancing on the shack with lethal stealth. From his vantage, he could just see the shack's sod roof. No smoke. Good girl. Then he saw Cade appear at the edge of the clearing, his rifle raised. He saw Cole approach from the other side. They converged on the door. Cade kicked it in. The silence that followed was the longest 10 seconds of Elias' life. Then Cade emerged, his expression furious. He gestured to Cole and they began a systematic search of the small clearing, kicking through snow, looking under the collapsed lean-to. They found nothing. No Alina. No evidence. just the cold ashes of a very small, days-old fire. Elias felt a surge of wild hope. She was gone. She'd somehow found the strength to move. But to where? And in her condition, how far could she have gotten? Cade stalked back to him, untied him with a vicious yank, and shoved him toward the shack. She's not there, but someone was, recently. Where is she? I told you, Elias said, trying to sound baffled. She left days ago. Maybe squatters, trappers use that shack sometimes. The sled tracks end here, Cole said, joining them, pointing at the obvious grooves in the snow leading right to the door. Your sled. You brought something heavy here. What was it? Elias was running out of lies. Supplies. I was going to fix the place up for spring, changed my mind, left the supplies inside. He nodded toward the empty shack. Cade wasn't buying it. He stepped in close again, his face inches from Elias. I think you're lying through your teeth. I think you have her. I think you're hiding her. And I think you know exactly what she's carrying. His hand shot out and grabbed the front of Elias' coat. The company doesn't just show appreciation, rancher. It also shows consequences. You can give her to us, walk away with a fat purse for your trouble, or you can die out here in the snow and we'll find her anyway. It might just take a little longer. Elias held his gaze, saying nothing. The standoff was broken by a shout from the trees. Jens, the third man, came crashing down the slope on his horse, his face flushed. Foreman found something on the south ridge. Not a woman, a camp, 3 men, armed. They're not ours. Cade released Elias, his attention snapped to this new threat. Who are they? Don't know, rough looking. They've got a fire going like they're settled in, watching. A new, more terrible understanding dawned on Elias. Eleanor's journal had mentioned her husband was going to the Surveyor General. What if Michael Shaw hadn't been working entirely alone? What if he had partners, other claim holders who'd been swindled, who were also looking for the evidence? Or worse, what if this was another faction of the company, a rival group trying to intercept the samples for their own profit? The valley was no longer a hiding place. It was becoming a battlefield. Cade made a decision. Jens, you stay here. Watch this shack, watch this rancher. If he moves, shoot him. Cole, you're with me. We're going to have a look at these newcomers. He turned back to Elias, his eyes deadly. We're not done. You stay on this land. You try to run, or you try to warn anyone, and the last thing you'll see is my rifle sight. He and Cole mounted up and rode off at a gallop toward the south ridge. Jens gestured with his rifle for Elias to sit against a tree. The young gunman looked nervous, out of his depth. Elias sat, his mind churning. Eleanor was out there, alone, sick, possibly lost. A new armed group was in the valley, and he was under guard. The fragile plan had shattered completely. The 7-day clock had run out, and now the storm of violence was beginning. But as he sat there, a cold realization settled over him. Cade had left one man to watch him. One nervous, inexperienced man. It was the first mistake his pursuers had made, and Elias knew he had to make them pay for it. The time for hiding was over. Elias waited until the sound of Cade and Cole's horses faded completely into the timber. He sat motionless against the tree, his head down, playing the defeated prisoner. Jens, the young guard, paced a few yards away, his rifle held too tightly, his eyes darting between Elias and the silent tree line. The kid was scared, scared of Cade, scared of being alone, scared of the other armed men in the valley. Fear made people stupid. It also made them predictable. After 5 minutes of tense silence, Elias let out a low groan and slumped sideways, curling into himself as if in pain. Jen started. Hey, sit up. Elias groaned again, more pitifully. Cramp, he gritted out. In my leg from the cold, I can't straighten it. Jens took a hesitant step closer, his rifle wavering. Just sit still. It's seizing up, Elias gasped, his face contorted. You gotta let me stand, just for a second, or it'll not permanent. He thrashed his leg for effect, kicking up snow. Indecision warred on Jen's face. His orders were to watch, not to let the prisoner move. But the man was clearly in agony, and what harm could he do? All right, Jen said, stepping closer. Stand up slow, no tricks. Elias nodded, gritting his teeth. He used the tree to haul himself up, putting all his weight on his left leg, keeping his right bent and trembling. As he got mostly upright, he let out a sharp cry and buckled forward, as if the cramp had stabbed him anew. He stumbled directly into Jens. It was not an attack, just a clumsy, pained collapse. Jens instinctively brought his hands up to catch him, lowering the rifle muzzle. That was the moment. Ilya's right hand, which had been clutching his thigh, shot upward. He drove the stiffened fingers of his hand into the soft hollow of Jens' throat. The young man's eyes bulged. A wet, choked gasp escaped him as he staggered back, dropping the rifle and clawing at his neck. Ilya's didn't let him fall. He grabbed the front of Jens' coat, spun him, and slammed his head against the trunk of the pine tree. Once, Jens went limp. Ilya's caught him and lowered him silently to the snow. He checked his pulse, strong, but he'd be out for a while. He snatched up Jens' rifle and cartridge belt. He also took the man's coat. It was heavier than his own, and his hat. A quick search of the pockets yielded a handful of bullets, a folding knife, and a silver whiskey flask engraved with the initials SJCMC, San Juan Consolidated Mining Company. These weren't just hired guns. They were company men through and through. Now he was armed, but he was also hunted, and Alina was out here somewhere, sick and alone. He couldn't call out for her. He had to think like she would. She left the shack to avoid capture. She was weak, probably disoriented. She would seek shelter, but not something obvious. She would hide where they wouldn't think to look. His eyes scanned the draw. Above the shack, the slope grew steeper, littered with giant boulders that had tumbled down in some ancient slide. Among them were crevices, small caves. It was treacherous ground, especially in the snow, but it was concealment. He started to climb, moving from rock to rock, his breath plumbing in the air. He found her 10 minutes later, not in a cave but behind a massive fallen spruce, its upturned root system creating a natural linta packed with dead needles. She was curled in a ball, the oilcloth package clutched to her chest, the pistol lying unused beside her. Her eyes were closed. For a heart-stopping second, he thought she was dead. Then he saw the faint cloud of her breath. "Alina," he whispered, crouching beside her. Her eyes fluttered open. The gray was clouded with fever and exhaustion, but recognition dawned. "They came," she rasped. "I know, they're gone for now. One's down. The others went to check on the new camp to the south. We have to move. Can you walk?" She shook her head weakly. Tried, made it this far, no more. He couldn't carry her and the evidence and defend them. He made a decision. "We're not running, we're ending this." He helped her sit up, wrapped Jen's heavier coat around her. "Who are the men in the South Camp?" From the journal. She swallowed with difficulty. "I don't know. Michael, he was working with someone else. A claim holder who'd been ruined by the company. A man named Dobbs. He said he could get men, protect us. I was supposed to meet them at the creek fork, but..." She gestured to her own sickly state. "They might be Dobbs's men, or they might be another company team." Either way, they were a distraction, and Cade was walking into it. It was an opportunity. "We're going to use the confusion," Ilya said. "I'm going to get you to my cabin. It's the last place Cade will look now. Then I'm going to settle this." He half-carried, half-dragged her down the slope, avoiding the shack, cutting a wide berth back toward his homestead. It was a grueling journey. Twice, violent coughing fits stopped them, and he feared the sound would carry. But the wind was picking up, whistling through the pines, masking their movement. They reached the cabin from the rear. He got her inside and onto the bed. He stoked the fire, boiled water, and made her drink. The routine of caretaking was a strange anchor in the chaos. While she sipped the hot liquid, he spread the map from the oilcloth package on the table. He studied it, then her journal. The destination was clear, the office of the Surveyor General in Denver. But Denver was weeks away. They'd never make it with Cade and his men, and possibly others on their trail. There was another way, a shorter, more dangerous way. The nearest telegraph office was in Silverton. If he could get a message to the federal marshal in Denver, to Judge Carrington, with the core of the evidence, maybe just one sample and the assay report, it might be enough to launch an official investigation. It would draw the danger away from Alina and onto the proper authorities. But getting to Silverton meant crossing Cade's path. A plan, desperate and sharp, formed in his mind. He told Alina, her eyes widened. "It's suicide. It's the only play we have left," he said. "I need you to trust me." She looked at him for a long moment, this rancher who had lost his herd for her, who was now planning to walk into a gunfight for her. She nodded once. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay here, stay quiet. If anyone but me comes through that door, you shoot. You have the pistol, you know how to use it." He'd seen the determined set of her jaw when she'd held it earlier. She was no stranger to firearms. "I'll be back by nightfall, or I won't." He took one rock core sample and the folded assay report. He left the rest of the evidence with her. Then he did something that felt like the true point of no return. He went to a floorboard under his bed, pried it up, and pulled out a long, narrow object wrapped in an old army blanket. He unwrapped it. A Sharps buffalo rifle, its barrel long and cold. A weapon for war, not for hunting wolves. He hadn't touched it in 5 years, not since Wyoming. He loaded it with careful, ritualistic movements. He left the cabin not on foot but on Samson. He rode not toward the south ridge but east, climbing high up the valley wall to a rocky overlook he knew. From here he could see the thin column of smoke from the stranger's camp, and soon enough he saw movement. 2 figures on horseback, Cade and Cole, approaching the camp from the timber. He saw them dismount, rifles in hand, advance cautiously. He saw figures emerge from the camp to meet them. There was a discussion. Then suddenly, the discussion turned into a confrontation. Arms waved. He saw the glint of a drawn gun. The crack of a rifle shot echoed up the valley, faint but distinct. Then several more rapid fire. A gunfight had erupted. Cade and his man were pinned down, trading shots with the strangers. Elias' gambit was in motion. The 2 threats were canceling each other out. He didn't wait to see the outcome. He turned Samson and rode hard, not down into the valley, but along the high ridge line, heading south toward the trail to Silverton. He was counting on the fight occupying everyone. He made the 10-mile ride in under an hour, pushing Samson to his limit. The mining town lay in a deep bowl, smoke from 100 chimneys staining the gray sky. He went straight to the telegraph office, a small clapboard building next to the assay office. He dismounted, the Sharps rifle in his hand, drawing stares from men on the boardwalk. He pushed inside. The operator, a spectacled man in a green visor, looked up, startled. "I need to send a wire to the federal marshal's office in Denver, and to Judge Jeremiah Carrington. Priority." "That's expensive, mister," the operator said, eyeing the rifle. Elias slammed the silver core sample and the assay report on the counter. "This is evidence in a murder and a mining fraud. The San Juan Consolidated Company is involved. Men are dead. More will be. You send this wire, or I'll find someone who will, and I'll make sure they know you refused." The operator paled. He nodded, pulled out a form. Elias dictated a concise message. "To Marshal Denton and Judge Carrington. Evidence in hand confirms fraud and homicide by San Juan Consolidated. Geologist Michael Shaw murdered. His widow Alina Shaw in possession of core samples and assay reports proving silver theft. Currently besieged at Thorn Ranch in Upper Animas Valley. Company foreman Cade and armed men present. Request immediate intervention. Signed, Elias Thorn." He paid with the last of his own coin, plus a few from Jen's pocket. "You send that right now," he ordered. The operator nodded, his hands flying over the key. Elias walked out. His job was half done. Now he had to get back alive. He remounted Samson and left Silverton at a trot, but instead of taking the main trail back, he cut up a steep mining track that switchbacked up the opposite side of the valley. It would take longer, but it would bring him out on the high ridge above his own land, giving him the advantage of elevation. The ride back was a blur of cold and tension. As he neared his valley, he heard no more gunshots. An ominous silence lay over the afternoon. He left Samson hidden in a copse of spruce and crept forward on foot to the overlook. The stranger's camp was abandoned. A single dark shape lay on the ground near the dead fire. One of Cade's men, one of theirs, he couldn't tell. He scanned his homestead, no movement, the cabin looked as he left it. Then he saw it, a single horse still saddled tied to his porch rail, not Samson, a stranger's horse. Someone was in his cabin with a leaner. He moved like a shadow down the slope, the Sharp's rifle held ready. He approached from the rear, slipping to the one window that looked into the main room. He risked a glance. Alina was on the bed, propped up, the pistol in her hand resting on the blanket, pointed at the door. And sitting in Elia's chair by the table, a blood-soaked bandage wrapped around his upper arm, was Cade. He had his own rifle across his knees. They were locked in a silent, deadly stalemate. Cade was talking, his voice low and tired. "Just the job, ma'am. I don't have a quarrel with you. But that evidence, I can't let it leave this valley. My life ain't worth a plugged nickel if it does." "Then you're already a dead man," Alina said, her voice stronger than Elia's expected. "Because it will leave. If not with me, then with someone else." "Your husband was a good geologist," Cade said, almost conversationally. "But he didn't understand the politics, the money. This is bigger than a few assay reports." Elias had heard enough. He stepped to the front door, took a deep breath, and kicked it open. Both rifles in the room swung toward him. He stood in the doorway, the long barrel of the Sharps leveled at Cade's chest. "Drop it," Elias said, his voice flat. Cade looked from the buffalo rifle to Elias' face. He saw no bluff there. His shoulders sagged. He let his rifle clatter to the floor. "Cole's dead," he said dully. "Those men in the camp, they were Pinkertons, hired by a rival board member. They weren't here to save you. They were here to steal the evidence for a different set of thieves. Got Cole in the first volley. I got 2 of them. The rest pulled back." So the conspiracy had more layers. It didn't matter now. "On your feet," Elias ordered. He grabbed a coil of rope from a hook. He bound Cade's hands behind his back, then his ankles. He sat him back in the chair. "The wire sent," Elias said to Alina, "to the marshal and the judge with our location." A flicker of hope lit her eyes. Cade just closed his. "Then it's over." They waited. The afternoon waned. Elias kept watch at the window. Just as the sun dipped behind the western peaks, he saw them, 6 riders moving in a tight, professional column down his valley trail. In the lead rode a man with a federal marshal star pinned to his coat. Beside him was an older man in a city suit, bundled against the cold. Judge Carrington. The law had come. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of statements, evidence collection, and grim-faced lawmen. Cade, sullen and cooperative in defeat, gave a full confession, implicating the general manager of the San Juan Consolidated and 2 members of the Territorial Surveyor's Office. The Pinkerton agents, what was left of them, were rounded up. The core samples and Alina's journal were sealed as evidence. Elias gave his statement, omitting only the part about subduing Jens. He described finding Alina, her illness, the threats. The marshal, a pragmatic man named Denton, looked at the broken fence, the scattered herd, and the exhausted rancher standing protectively near the sick widow's bedside. He didn't ask many questions. On the 3rd morning, they prepared to leave. Alina was stronger, able to sit a horse with help. She was to travel to Denver with the marshal and the judge to see the prosecution through. As she stood by her horse, wrapped in a borrowed coat, she turned to Elias. The silence between them was full of everything that couldn't be said: gratitude, grief, the shared weight of the past week. "What will you do?" she asked. "The herd is gone," Elias finished. He looked out at his empty valley. "The sacrifice was total. I'll manage, I always have." She reached into the pocket of her dress, his flannel shirt, he realized, and pulled out a folded paper. It was the map from the oilcloth package. She had drawn a new mark on it in pencil, a small X on a ridge not far from his cabin. "Michael's last survey," she said softly. Before they knew he was onto them, he found a secondary vein, small but rich, not on any company map. "The claim papers are in my satchel. It's in my name." She pressed the map into his hand. "It's not a herd, but it's a start for both of us." He stared at the map, then at her. It was more than a gift, it was a partnership, a future where he had thought there was none. Judge Carrington approached, clearing his throat. "The territory will be seeking witnesses for the trial, Mr. Thorne. Your testimony will be required, and given the vindictiveness of the parties involved, it might be prudent for you to consider a change of scenery for a time. Denver has need of honest men who aren't afraid to stand up." Elias looked from the judge to Alina. He saw the unspoken invitation in her gray eyes. The Silent Valley had been his penance. Now perhaps it was time to rejoin the world. He nodded slowly. "I'll be there." He watched them ride out, the marshal's party with their prisoner and their witness, until they disappeared into the trees. The silence of the valley descended again, but it felt different now. It was no longer a retreat. It was simply a place waiting. He had lost his herd, his solitude, his old life. But as he turned and walked back toward the cabin, the map warm in his hand, he understood the trade. He had saved a life, and in doing so had finally found a reason to stop running. The 7-day fever had burned away the past, and from its ashes, something new could begin. The story of Elias Thorne and Alina Shaw is more than a tale of crisis in the snow. It is a blueprint of what happens when the world narrows to a single room, a single duty, and the walls between strangers dissolve under the relentless pressure of need. Medical historians note that in truly remote settings, the average time for professional emergency help can stretch to 30 minutes or more. In the Colorado Rockies of 1889, it could be days. In that gap, ordinary people become surgeons, nurses, and guardians. The 7-day vigil Elias kept was an extreme example of the caregiver burden that still exists anywhere geography isolates the sick from the system. Alina's fever was the catalyst, but the real transformation happened in the quiet spaces between changing cloths and spooning broth. It was in the shared language of survival. The frontier historian would call it a necessity. The psychologist would recognize the powerful attachment bonds that form when one person becomes another's sole source of safety and comfort. Elias didn't just save a life. He rebuilt his own humanity in the process, discovering that the capacity for connection wasn't buried with his past, but merely waiting for a purpose worthy of it. The silver fraud was exposed. The San Juan Consolidated Mining Company was dismantled by federal courts, its assets seized. Cade's testimony, given in exchange for a lesser sentence, brought down corrupt officials in the territorial capital, and the small, rich claim on the ridge that Alina marked. It was developed not by a faceless corporation, but by a partnership. It provided the capital that rebuilt a herd, and it funded a new life in Denver, where Elias Thorne did indeed become a respected witness, and later, a quiet investor in legitimate enterprises. He and Alina remained bound, not by romance as the novels might have it, but by something perhaps more durable, the profound, unshakable trust of people who have seen each other at the absolute brink. So what remains when the drama fades? It's the enduring question of what we owe each other when no one is watching. Elias Thorne could have shut his gate. He would have kept his herd, preserved his solitude, and lived out his years in silent routine. He would have been morally clear, but he opened the gate. He chose the devastating, bankrupting, life-altering path of care, and in losing everything he thought defined him, he found everything that actually did. These stories are all around us, hidden in plain sight. The modern equivalents play out in distant farmhouses, in apartments during blackouts, on highways during storms, wherever one person's crisis lands in the lap of another. The names and the settings change, but the essential calculus does not. Do I protect what is mine, or do I answer what is needed? If this story of a rancher, a widow, and a 7-day fever reshaped how you see the simple, monumental act of showing up for a stranger, then you understand the legacy they left behind. It's a legacy written not in court transcripts or mining deeds, but in the quiet understanding that sometimes the most important journey is the one that begins when you stop moving and choose to stay. If you want to uncover more forgotten stories where a single choice changed everything, Hit that subscribe button and join us. We dive deep every time. Thanks for watching.